You're listening to the Platform Engineering Podcast, your expert guide to the fascinating world of platform engineering. Each episode brings you in-depth interviews with industry experts and professionals who break down the intricacies of platform architecture, cloud operations, and DevOps practices. From tool reviews to valuable lessons from real-world projects to insights about the best approaches and strategies, you can count on this show to provide you with expert knowledge that will truly elevate your own journey in the world of platform engineering.
Thanks for tuning into the Platform Engineering Podcast. I'm your host, Cory O'Daniel, and with me is Adam Jacob, co-founder of Chef and System Initiative. Thanks for coming, Adam.
Yeah, thanks.
Before we get it started today, can you share a bit about your background and what sparked your interest in infrastructure, automation, and management?
Sure. I started my career as a systems administrator when I was a kid. When I was like 8 or 9. My parents bought like a 286 and it had a modem, and I discovered bulletin boards, and I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And so then I was obsessed with like running bulletin boards and running, FidoNet nodes and that kind of stuff, which then meant that when the internet sort of happened in the United States, I happened to be like one of the people who knew how modems works, and like knew how to run the systems. And so then all of us sort of naturally fell into running ISPs. So I ran ISPs for a long time. And then, at some point you got everybody on the internet and you had to build applications. And so then I shifted into being a systems administrator that ran like production web applications and then big corporate infrastructure. After that, I became a consultant that did fully automated infrastructure. So we had a consultancy that just did fully automated infrastructure, soup to nuts, application deployment, monitoring, trending, configuration management, provisioning, all of that was sort of included in a package of full automation. That led us to create Chef, which then we launched a venture-backed startup. And I was roughly the CTO of Chef for the majority of that. I had a bunch of different titles because that's sort of the way it goes. But I'm thinking me as the CTO is not wrong. And then now System Initiative, I'm the CEO and, still building automation, because what I am really at heart is a systems administrator. All the other things I do are offshoots of that initial love of building systems and networks.
Yeah, let me ask you a question about that. So is this your first time as a CEO?
Yeah.
What was that? Sorry, this is a little bit of an aside, but like, what was that transition like for you? Like going from a mostly technical role to being a CEO of a startup?
Well, I mean, CEOing a startup with 17 people, where what you're building is a deeply technical product. Like like today, what I'm doing is we're getting closer and closer to System Initiative being ready for production workloads. And, God willing, and the creek don't rise, we're days away. And so, there's a list of bugs, and you're burning through those bugs, and you're coordinating on the team. And, I'm doing product person work. Startups are always a journey of like everybody doing a little bit of everything. And depending on your talent and, where your skills lie, you may be called upon to do one thing or another. So, I think what I learned watching a bunch of great people be the CEO of Chef and other people that I've known in industry sort of over the years was that, CEOing is primarily a judgment game, and CTOing is similar in that like you, exactly how you do it and what's right or wrong. It's not like there's a script that's like, oh, CEO should never blah, 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 or CTO should never blah, blah, blah. People love to say that stuff. Can I swear? Is swearing okay?
Yeah.
They love to say shit like that, but it's mostly not real, because it's usually coaching from the outcome. When people tell you stuff like that, it's usually because, well, I tried it and this bad thing happened to me. And like, fair enough. There can be wisdom to be found there, but for the most part, it's more about just figuring out like, how do you think about building a company? How do you think about constructing teams? How do you think about building a culture that helps people understand like what we're here to do, why it matters, why their work connects to why it matters, and then how to inspire people to achieve greatness for themselves and therefore also for the company and the product. And that's so fun. So, as a transition, it's a delight because I love doing that work and it's so interesting and fun to do. And then, a lot of the work that you think of as like, what's CEO work? It's like, well, you have to have enough capital. You have to, make sure you can pay everybody. Like there's a lot of that stuff. I have a co-founder who's a fantastic COO who takes care of a lot of some of those things for me, for us, not for me, for him too, makes it sound like he's doing it for me. He's not, anyway, I didn't mean to make it weird, but yeah.
We like it weird.
No.
Very cool. And do you, so are you actively doing development still, or are you just so caught up on like the product side? Okay, nice.
I try to stay out of the critical path, but sometimes you can be out of the critical path and sometimes you can't. I love building products. I love and being an engineer. Part of what I learned in the journey at Chef was that I like the whole of the game. Some people like some pieces more than others. They're like, oh, I don't really like selling, but I like writing code, or I don't like product. I like all of it. I like marketing. I like sales. I just like all of it. I think it's fun. And I like the structure of it. And so, yeah, I predict that I will remain a person who writes code forever. Regardless of how big or successful the company becomes. Will I be, I won't be doing it every day. But if you have the skill, I think it's a valuable and important thing to touch the truth of the product you build and what it does and doesn't do for people.
I like that. So let's rewind the Chef just a bit. So for people that are unfamiliar with Chef, can you give a short description of what Chef is and where the idea came from?
Yeah, Chef is a configuration management system. So, it came from sort of a lovely history, starting with CF Engine 2 is the primary branch of sort of ancestry for thinking about Chef.
That's cool.
And then Puppet was another sort of entrance into that market. So, CF Engine 2 was the first, I would say, sort of configuration management system, open source configuration management system that felt modern and flexible. And a lot of us built really large automated infrastructure on top of CF Engine. And then Puppet sort of brought in a different perspective where CF Engine was kind of constrained in terms of how you thought about when things happen. So the big moment for CF Engine 2 was this idea of idempotent and convergent operations, and that it didn't really matter what order things were going to be applied in. What mattered most was that the operations were idempotent, and then eventually the system would sort of self-heal. And so it kind of thought about the world in terms of types of things you needed to do, like install packages or configure files or do whatever. Puppet started to think of the world in terms of resources that needed to be in a particular state, and that you were constructing like a big graph of all the resources that you wanted to have be managed on a given operating system. And we talk about these things where we're for CF Engine and for Puppet and for Chef, you're mostly in Ansible. You're mostly talking about operating system instances. Similar techniques and technology go into like Terraform and Pulumi and the CDK, and right, like it's all kind of a piece, but what you're managing changes. But anyway, so Puppet brings about this idea of like resource management. And what Chef brought into the idea was that was primarily that what you should be doing is writing this kind of configuration as software first, using a programming language instead of you writing a DSL. So instead of having a language like CF Engine or Puppet did, where it was a specific DSL and then you learned it like the same way you learned the syntax to like Apache or Nginx, but instead you just used Ruby, and there was an internal DSL in Ruby that allowed you to express your configuration. And what that meant was it was particularly good when things got weird. Yeah. So, when things were straightforward, the DSLs were fantastic. But Chef would let you do crazy shit. So, a great example here was there was a big media company that had a very popular TV show where people had to vote once a week. And they had a huge amount of infrastructure that they kept running all the time, just waiting for the one day a week where the votes came in. And so this team automated a way that infrastructure and turned it into a thing that they could just turn on and turn off, the day before and the day after. And they did it with Chef, and they were really excited. And they called me in and they were like, Adam, we got to show you what we built with Chef. It was so cool. We solved this huge business problem. I was stoked. I went to the meeting, and what they did was just write a bunch of Ruby. They didn't use any Chef really, except to like execute their code. Like Chef was like the runner.
Yeah.
And my reaction to that moment was fucking fantastic. I was like, amazing. You crushed it, because they did. They fucking killed it. They completely solved their problem. And then I was like, let me show you how to solve it with Chef. Like, we can make it a little leaner. We can do it a little more elegantly. But that point of view that was like, ultimately, this is like a pragmatic choice where what you're doing is really creating this powerful tool that's designed for experts to solve really powerful problems. That's really what Chef was. And it came out of my experience using the other tools to try to have really big ambitions, whereas like, we're going to automate everything. Like, what if everything was completely automated? And the answer there, if the language is constraining, is like, well, mostly everything.
Yeah.
Mostly everything, but it only works one time. It works 200 times, but not 250 times in a row. And you're like, no, I need that shit to work 250 times in a row. Like, so.
Nice. So it's funny. I think the first time, so I was in a very, you said first open source. I was in a very similar scenario. I remember we had a tool internally that we used that was declarative-ish.
Sure.
I think it was YAML based. And then I got actually introduced to Chef by the team at Engine Yard. I'd moved on to another company. Yeah. We had this nightmare homegrown thing that was like YAML based infrastructure management. I love myself some YAML, but not that way. And I got to see Chef first at Engine Yard, and I think it's pretty much kind of set my path, in my career around DevOps and managing cloud.
Yeah, I mean, Ezra Zygmuntovich, if I hadn't written Chef, Ezra would have written Chef.
Yeah,
and when we found each other and I got to show him what Chef was, like, it was really Ezra who first saw Chef and understood what it could be and was like, that's what I want. It's what I've always wanted. And we're going to use it at Engine Yard. And like, before Chef was publicly launched, like Ezra and I were sitting in that Engine Yard office, building Chef together and making it work for Engine Yard's needs. And and unfortunately, Ezra's no longer with us, but Ezra's an incredible trailblazer in this field that, I think at this point, enough time has passed since his passing that I think many people forget. But yeah, Ezra was an Engine Yard too, like really pivotal in the history of Chef and certainly in my life. So yeah.
He was also the first person to introduce me to Erlang, which
exactly.
Chef server was written in Erlang, right?
It was, yes. Yeah. Rest in peace, Ezra.
Yeah.
What a guy.
He's an awesome guy. Okay. Sorry.
It's okay. We were now having an ad hoc Ezra memorial. So I too am having a moment where I'm like, oh man, I'm like remembering my lost friend. And I'm like, I kind of wish I could call Ezra right now and be like, I was just talking about that. Do you remember how great that was?
Yeah.
So hug your friends.
Yeah. Hug your friends, man. Cool. So was that your first big, like, I guess like customer win or like use case was Engine Yard, or were there other like surprising use cases or industries besides the company that was using Chef as a runner?
I mean, that was later on. I mean, like Chef was everywhere. And in Chef and Puppet both like sort of created what is, I think, the modern sort of DevOps market. Like those companies were pretty pivotal in doing it. I think CF Engine was too. It had a little less commercial success than Puppet and Chef did, but those tools, then those companies really sort of were a little trailblazing in the creation of the broader market that would eventually lead you to, to the HashiCorps and the Pulumis and other folks that sort of came after. Early on, the early Chef customers were folks who used Puppet, who had some of the similar problems that I had trying to use Puppet to solve some of those problems. There was a particularly bad bug in Puppet that was really hard to track down. And there was one kid in New Zealand who could reproduce this bug, and I helped fix that bug and then decided that I was over it, And so, he was an early Chef user. So there was a cohort of people who kind of came together to help build those early versions of Chef and to sort of make it all work. But yeah, Ezra was certainly the first person, and Engineard was the first like commercial user of Chef, and they were using Chef in production essentially immediately.
Yeah. So it's funny. I was reading the State of CD report. I can't remember if it was 2023 or 2024. And it's, all these reports, like we don't have access to all the data behind them, but
sure.
It said something like only 27% of like 19,000 companies were doing IAC like in 2023, right? That number might not be exactly right, but like, I feel like
that feels real.
It does feel real though. But I feel like a lot of companies like, that I'll meet in my day to day, like still aren't doing infrastructure as code. And at the time when you were working on Chef, like what types of challenges and cultural hurdles did you face? Like this was happening like right around the same time that the actual DevOps movement was kind of getting founded. And
a little before. The DevOps movement sort of came a little after, not a lot, within years. To the mists of time, it's no big deal. But at the time, there was definitely like the configuration management and automated infrastructure sort of movement got sort of swallowed up in DevOps as a part of a bigger transition, because it was clear that the capabilities that these tools provided weren't enough to sort of get to the full business outcomes that people really wanted to have. They were great, but there was a bigger transition that needed to happen in order for people to really get to a place where they were, reliably shipping software. At the time, the target was like 10 times a day, which a lot of people still really struggle with, right? Like we chuckle because we're like 10 times isn't that often, but like a lot of people who listen to this podcast, they can't ship that shit 10 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go look at the John Ospaw and Paul Hammond's talk that they gave at Velocity, which was 10 deploys a day at Flickr, and how they did it, that's DevOps. And today, that's still what we do.
Yeah. And
it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if this is a platform engineering podcast. People will be like, well, we've transcended DevOps because it's platform engineering now. You haven't. You're doing it exactly the way that John and Paul told you to. The only difference is the tools. Like you've made different choices about, you don't use Ganglia anymore or whatever, or you put a different dashboard in front of it. But the workflow you're using, the way you do this work is exactly the way that they told you to.
Yeah.
In 2000 and whatever, 6, whatever it was. And I think the cultural transitions we had to go through to get you there, people forget what it was like when there was operations and development, but they were very separate things. Systems administrator appreciation day was a thing, because, and the only people who have appreciation days are people you don't appreciate. You know what I mean?
Ouch. I mean, valid, but ouch.
I mean, it hurts.
Yeah.
As somebody who spent most of my professional life as a person no one cared about, like I was a Morlock. I wasn't an Eloi. And I think so I'm allowed to say it because it was true. It was my people,
Yeah.
And I think so some of those cultural transitions were just getting people to recognize that the operations piece mattered and it was as important as the engineering piece, and that there was a valid career path that existed. Becoming great at operations was the same as becoming great at engineering, and that as you became good in both paths, like you eventually sort of reached the top of the pyramid, and it was sort of indistinguishable from one another. I think, another was the idea that for a long time, developers were allowed to write code and operations people didn't. They could write shell scripts, they could, do some shit in Perl or whatever, a little Python, but they weren't like real programmers. And you still see this a little now. And so just getting people to the place where they recognize that, no, actually, if what you are is a skilled operations person and you understand how to put together a complex infrastructure at scale and configure it and manage it and do all this every time, you're a programmer. The language you're writing happens to be the language of this infrastructure. It happens to be the language of how the switches are configured or how the cloud resources are instantiated or whatever, but you're programming. And what we need to do is start thinking about it and treating you with the same kind of respect that software developers had. I think now, because of some of the the issues we have with the way that we put the system together that we taught people to use. We still automate infrastructure and the full stack exactly the way that I designed my consulting company almost 20 years ago now, right? And I'm so proud of that, because it's very rare to come to like be a part of something that has that kind of longevity and works as well as it does. But it hasn't really changed. And so the outcomes that we're seeing, especially in big companies, tends to be mediocre. So, people tend to fall into the middle where they're like, well, we had these big aspirations, but mostly we get ground down because of the way that we work didn't change enough.
Yeah.
And so, I think now the challenge is people are now ascribing some of the positive cultural change that came from the DevOps movement as the problem. They're like, well, now the problem is that my developers have to write all this operational code, which was never the point of DevOps.
Exactly.
But now we start to see silos reemerge. You start to see people's marketing materials say things like your engineers should write code, and operations people, all the operations people stuff should be an API that people hit through a thing. And there's some risk in that messaging of going back to how it was in 2001.
Yeah.
And most people don't remember what it was like to do this work in 2001, because most of them weren't doing it. And so they will get to rediscover for themselves the joy of what happens when you build those kinds of walls in between the teams.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, like the 10 times a day thing. I mean, sorry, I'm a big reader of reports. I love reading the industry reports.
Yeah.
But like the last Dora report, like the first 3 pages are like all thumbs up. And then you get to like page 37 and it's just like sadness. Like it's like the amount of companies are still deploying like once a month
is the majority.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's a real thing. Like
it's a real thing. But we've just we've just moved the goalposts, somewhere on this bookshelf behind me, I have a copy of the DevOps handbook. And, I think the very first paragraph of the DevOps handbook is like, we want every company in the world to be deploying 10, hundreds, or thousands of times a day with like ease. And this isn't the actual quote, but it's like, ease and grace is what came to mind. And like, that shit is not what's happening, So if you just look at our own aspirations and what we wanted to have happen for each other as people, forget about the impact on industry, just what we wanted the experience of our peers to be like. We just didn't quite deliver what we hoped for. I'm proud of what we did deliver. I'm so proud of it. It was really difficult. It's so much better than it was. It's great. And it did not live up to what we hoped it would live up to. And it's a bummer.
Yeah. I think one of the things, like as a software developer, like the most rewarding is like seeing your code in prod, not just sitting there and writing it and seeing it in a PR, and right, that goal of like being able to have that reward happen multiple times a day that didn't get realized for many people definitely sucks. And it's like, I feel like in that scenario where you're getting deployed once a month, like you end up with more anxiety about that time rolling around.
Yeah, you probably wind up with more anxiety. I think even if you don't, you definitely wind up more disconnected from the outcomes of your work. And if you look at like the Dora report or you look at those things, like the number one indicator is not that you deploy a lot. It's actually that the consistency of the outcomes are high. And we know that the number one driver of those consistently high outcomes is how tightly the team was connected.
Yeah.
It's how frequently we talk to each other. It's how together we are in that loop of what are we building? Who is it for? How do we work together to do it? Because in modern software delivery stacks, and especially in large enterprises, but everywhere, the complexity is too high for any one person to handle. You can't be the person who understands how all the code rolls through Citibank.
Yeah.
That's just not a thing. So like you have to build teams that can effectively collaborate through these mechanisms. And we're still learning, I think, how to do that. This first generation that I think is still where we are for the most part in the industry. We took the way we did it as startups and as engineers, and we just tried to blow it up into huge, bigger scale for everybody. And, the answer is, yeah. But in retrospect, it turns out that like it didn't work as well as we hoped. But like it wasn't a bad idea, like it's not because it was a bad choice. It was a pretty reasonable thing to decide to try. But but I think history tells us it didn't work quite the way we thought.
Yeah. And like at the time you were working on Chef, I mean, and honestly, I think probably most of our lives the past 20 years, like the way that we operate software has changed a lot, right? Like, 25 years ago, we're all in data centers. And then,
Mhm.
20-ish years ago, we had VMs, right? And then all of
Yeah.
a sudden containers came around, then big containerization with like Kubernetes and
Yeah.
serverless, et cetera. So like as, big cloud kind of changed over the years and, we started getting containerization, like how has that impacted your philosophy around operations and the work you were doing in Chef at the time? And how has that led to where you are today?
Yeah. I mean, it each of those things brings about both a technological capability that you didn't have before. So, people forget, but in the era before EC2, that was the era of Facebook apps.
Yeah. Forgot about that era.
And Facebook apps was the first time on the internet that you could just have a thing that you launched yesterday, and today you have 10 million users.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I had friends who I had worked with for years who were working for companies that launched a Facebook app, and suddenly that happened to them. And they were literally calling everyone they knew, just begging for gear. They were like, do you have rack mount servers like in your closet? Do you have like unused, like we will, whatever, because they literally couldn't rack systems fast enough for the immediate demand. And so like those problems, we made choices about how to solve them in terms of, Amazon built EC2, other people built stuff. Those eventually the good user experience pieces will out. So, a good example there is Docker, where for as much good as a lot of other containerization stuff is done, still the true magic of Docker is the Docker file. Yeah. It's just the ability that like once I express what it is that I want in this thing, which I can do pretty much by writing a shell script, like what I get out is this repeatable artifact that then boots really quickly. And everybody who kind of ran, Docker run -it, whatever the service was they wanted, and hit enter, and it just like downloaded an image from the internet and ran that shit, like you would crawl over broken glass for that. And yeah. So it sort of changed the what it meant to think about experiencing this kind of automation. Forget about what it did technically. The user experience of it was such a leap forward that you could never go backwards. Like once you experienced it, you were like, oh, if it's not like that, then it's garbage. And, eventually that sort of list of things and those capabilities, like they do find their niches. They sort of settle into, well, here's the places where they make sense. Here's the places where they don't. Things like containers, it turns out they make sense in a lot of places. Things like serverless, well, maybe it makes sense in fewer places than we thought, right? At least in its current form. But how it changes your approach to automation and tooling is mostly by thinking about how do you want the interaction model to change. So, it's less a question of like, how do I want to change the idea of automation? It's more, given these new capabilities, what new interactions can I enable for people at different parts of the process? So, if you're an operations person and, you used to have to build automated provisioning systems by making the right layer 2 networks and DHCP servers and BootP and like this whole list. And then you could get to a place where you could rack servers and they would automatically install themselves. Now you don't. Now you got to figure out how to build an AMI, Yeah. And like, but it's, it's roughly the same thing as figuring out what the BootP image was that I was going to boot when you like built a data center. Like it's exactly the same. And so it's really about what changed is the interaction. What changed is the API. What changed is the and so focusing on that layer is where, to me, all the interesting stuff lives, because the impact, you can't control which technology is going to come into the world, what people like, what they don't like, right? Like I've never really loved Kubernetes, not because I think it's bad technology or people who like it are bad or whatever. It's just whatever. Most of the things I have built seem to not need it. Which I don't think that's not a condemnation in any way of people who do need it or who love it or who whatever. It's great. But it doesn't matter if I like it or not. It's a thing that I need to automate because people do like it and they want to use it. And having an argument that begins, as somebody who automates stuff for a living, if your argument begins with, well, you should only use technology I like in the way that I like it, it tends to be a losing argument. So, you have to think about how to build automation that can automate things you didn't understand or that you don't like or that you don't expect or you don't agree with. And, frequently the winners in this space are people who embraced that kind of pragmatism. And there's always a lane for the people who don't, who are like, hey, this is a very opinionated, one-way street kind of move. Over time, I think those tools tend to do less well.
So like looking, at like looking back at Chef and like where you are today, like what do you think, or what do you hope that Chef's most significant and like lasting contributions are to the infrastructure as code and DevOps field?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, the thing that Chef did that I carry with me more than any other choice we made, we had plenty of technical contributions to sort of the art of how you build that kind of automation or those kinds of things. I don't like hope that people remember. You know what I mean? Like, I don't hope that people look at Pulumi and go, the Chef guys are the ones who taught us how to do that. That's fine. I don't care. What I do care about, and what I think is the lasting legacy of Chef and what I'm most proud of is that Chef as a product and as a community, it transformed the lives of a really significant number of people who, because of where we were when we started, because of who we were as people and how we brought that software to them, they learned that they were more than they thought that they could be in terms of what they could do in their job, the impact they could have, how much fun it would be to do. It turns out when you fix the interaction model on a job that sucks, the job doesn't suck so much.
Yeah.
And then people can thrive in ways that they couldn't before because just the day-to-day grind of the work they were doing was holding them back. And then, when something like Chef comes along, and it's not Chef that did this for them. Do you know what I mean? Like, they did it for themselves because they found Chef and they were like, this is my ticket. And then they used Chef in order to really materially alter the course of their lives. That is like, there's no better legacy than knowing that that's true. And I know it's true because people come up to me still today and they will be like, are you Adam Jacob? Did you make Chef? And then tell me the story of how Chef changed their life. And there's nothing, what better possible validation could there be? And, the rest of it, how successful were you or weren't you at running venture capital companies, or how well did you adapt to this strategic disruption, or, whatever those things were. They're interesting and fun stories, and it's fun to talk about them. But, when you think about like what matters and what do I hope, like what I hope is that, the people that were touched by that software and that made it a part of the fabric of their life and then improved their own lives through the work that they did with it. I hope that they look back on those moments in their lives and with pride and with affection. I hope that it was as good for them as it was for me.
Yeah. Awesome. And I'm one of those people. I mean, honestly, like I was a Ruby developer for a very long time, and I kind of fell backwards into what we now call a DevOps role. And like I said, like dealing with like these internal tools we built was miserable. And the first time I used Chef, I was just like, wait, this is like my worlds are converging. Like my development side that has all this Rails experience, and like the ability to like manage infrastructure, which I was interested in, and like being able to see those two worlds come together was very exciting for me. We're in a new world now though. Right. And I feel like, when we look at where the cloud has gotten us, like our applications are just a bit different. Like for companies that are truly leaning into the cloud, right? We're not just running on the cloud. Like our software is composed of the cloud, right? SQS queues, SNS queues, glue jobs. Like our infrastructures have gotten pretty like wild maybe even unwieldy. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges we're going to face from this point on, especially like the advent of AI and where AI is going? Like, what challenges are we going to have as far as operating our software? And what challenges do you think we're going to have just culturally and as a part of our teams?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest challenge is a user experience one. I think if you simply sit with the people who do the work, or if you're a person who's listening to this podcast and you do some of this work, either as an application developer, as an operations person, as a DevOps person, as a platform engineer, whatever your role is, and you just ask yourself, how much do I like the experience of how all these things come together? And what's it feel like to do my day to day? And where are the moments in my career where I felt true joy in the way that the work I needed to do and the tools that I was using to do it aligned to give me that moment of just pure, perfect Zen? Rails is a great example. Every single person who touched Rails in that initial glorious era of Rails forever transformed, because what it meant to write applications like that was so much better. I mean, it wasn't like a little better. It was crazy better.
Yeah.
And once you felt it, everything from there forward had to be at least that good. And if it wasn't, you were like, you are a Luddite. And so, and it's because it was worse. It's because no one was going to take that joy from you. The same thing is true for Docker, right? No one is going to give up the joy of running Docker build and deploying. It's so good. And so I think that user experience challenge for us is that we haven't really rethought the way that the entirety of the system connects together. We still essentially automate our workflows and the cloud and our data centers and all of those components exactly the way that we automated stuff when I started a consulting company 20 years ago. And what's different are the tools, right? You don't use the provisioning scripts aren't the same anymore. Now you use Terraform. But if I was building a checklist of the things you had to cover off on, it's the same slot. You do it at the same time. The way it relates to the other tools, the same. And right now, for a lot of the industry, the best answer that they have is, well, we'll abstract those things from you. I'll give you a portal. I'll build a different kind of API. I'll do whatever. But they're not really changing the fundamental shape of how we're doing the work. And my belief is that the trouble, we've done enough innovation in the last era to know that simply adding better tooling at the same slots in the stack just isn't going to change the outcomes. And more abstraction on top of that same tooling, I don't think will change it either. Because I think while it can change the user experience for some parts of the work, for others, it's going to make it materially worse, right? Your ability to understand what's happening in the low level will go way, way down because your only interactions are at these really high level platforms where once those platforms don't work, your ability to pierce that veil and solve the deeper problems will go down, which means the platform will be adopted only in places where it fits and not in places where it doesn't, which then hurts the learning value of that abstraction sort of over time, which then kind of leads you to the Dora report where you're like, and in the end, on average, we deploy once a month.
Yeah.
And so I think our challenge as an industry is we have to fall in love again with the fact that we have control over these systems. These systems are not bigger than we are. They're not more complex than we can understand. We can know the details. And so that enables us to envision a different shape where the outcomes are different, but we don't have to lose what we learned of the last 20 years of doing this work. We can evolve in a way that really leaps us forward. And I think that's the challenge for the industry is it's great and convenient to sort of stand on the shoulders of giants. But those giants didn't come from cautious leaps. CF Engine 2 wasn't a minor leap from shell scripts. It was an incredible leap from shell scripts, right? It was a massive transition. And And, Puppet and Chef, I would argue, were smaller transitions than CF Engine 2 was. Puppet was a pretty big transition, but Chef to Puppet wasn't that huge of a leap. There was some fundamental differences. Using a programming language is different, but like we're in an era now where what we need are new giant leaps forward. And those will be riskier. They'll be messier. They'll fail harder. Right? Like, but we need more of it, because I think we now know that without them, we kind of know what the results will be.
Yeah.
And so and I don't think that's more of a problem for us as engineers to each other, to just be like, no, Cory, like dream bigger, like get weirder, and we're just not weird enough anymore because it's become the standard. It's become, and people take for granted that that the way that we built those configuration management systems is now the way that your infrastructure as code tools are also built. Their architecture is the same. Like there's no difference really between in the internal engine of how Terraform reconciles state. The only difference is that they don't have an operating system they can interrogate. So they have to store it in data somewhere. And they, slap it into JSON. And like, okay, but is that the best we can do? Was that the right design? It's a fundamentally different part of the stack. Maybe it wasn't the best design to do that. Maybe there was a different way we could have gone. And I don't think we're doing enough exploration of those alternative paths. Instead, we're sort of resting in the middle.
Yeah. And I feel like, you have a great talk. I can't remember the exact title. It's what if IAC never existed, right?
Yeah.
And then, so it's like, I think I see two big leaps happening now, the work you're doing with System Initiative. And then there's this kind of other direction with like the winglangs.
Totally.
Right. So can you tell me a bit about, or can we talk a bit about System Initiative? Like what were some of the motivations behind System Initiative and the talk?
Yeah. And we can talk about Wing too. I think, but I think you're totally right that Wing is another perfect example of what I'm talking about. And, for System Initiative, it starts with the conversation we just had. So that was sort of the motivational piece for me, but also for my co-founders. And that belief that it was fundamentally a user experience problem led us to have, we've done 4+ years of R&D to get to a place where like in a minute, you're going to be able to use it in production. And that's because that's how hard the user experience problem was. Like if you wanted to deliver a fundamentally better user experience and sacrifice none of the power of your existing automation, it took 4 years of really deep R&D to get to a place where I believe that that's possible to do. It was not hard to build a toy that showed it'd be neato. It was really hard to build a power tool that was like, okay, but this will hold up, in some really complex condition I've never seen before when it's ready to be used at a bank or whatever. I think, and how System Initiative thought that through was by shifting the perspective of saying, well, one of the choices we made early on here was that we were going to automate these systems through writing code, and that we would treat them roughly like application artifacts. So the things that made building applications stable, continuous delivery, continuous integration, source control, that those things, we could just extend them naturally into the way we relate to infrastructure, and that through that extension, we would gain all the benefits and a degree of user experience that we enjoyed because we all wanted it to be programming. It turns out that the environments that we're managing, to your point from earlier, are significantly more dynamic than that. They change from all kinds of different points of view. They change underneath you. The cloud providers go up and down, services crash. There's a million things that happen that make those things less good. And so we wound up building systems that sort of start from their fundamental position of saying the source of truth is software, which is static. And it's supposed to be a reflection of the truth, but the truth is this incredibly dynamic environment that we don't even really understand and can't interrogate. And so System Initiative took that stuff, turned it into data. Then we took that data and we put it on this reactive hypergraph, because what you need now is the ability to program it. So you have to say, okay, I have some representation of what the truth is in the real world. Now I want to be able to really quickly make a change and see if it would work. Well, if I have to apply that change to the real world, it'll take 20 minutes or longer. And maybe it's production infrastructure and I don't want to take it down just to experiment. And so So now you have to be able to fork that thing, fork the data, and then we stick it on a graph where each piece of data, like individual piece of data, like a string, is the result of a function that is itself reactive to its arguments. And the side effect is that you wind up programming this big graph of reactive functions. And once we have that, I can now build a user interface that's more like Unity, or more like the things people use to make really complex movies than it is writing just an editor. Because I can visualize the data in interesting ways. So it turns out it's much faster to compose infrastructure if the infrastructure can tell, if different components of infrastructure can inform the configuration of each other. If I have a Docker image that exposes a port number, I should be able to say that the load balancer that load balances that container needs that port number as an input. And I can do it by showing it to you on a canvas and drawing a line. And then if I change the port number in the container, it'll update the load balancer. And then tell me in real time if that change would or wouldn't work. And it's kind of magic. But it took a very long time to build, super complicated, and is a big swing, right? But it's almost ready. And I'm stoked about later this year, you'll be able to use it to run real production infrastructure. And it's sick. Yeah. And I think Wing, sorry, I'm just going to go straight into Wing
let's do it.
Because I really like it. Wing, and I love Elad, who is the CEO of Wing. Wing's point of view is different. It says that those cloud systems, all those SNS queues and other things that we use, the problem is that the programming language itself, the way we express our application and business logic, needs to seamlessly integrate with the infrastructure as a piece of the code you're writing. And once we do that, we could build simulators in the same way that we build mocks for tests, which then give us these incredibly quick feedback loops around being able to locally build and test what are these very complicated cloud infrastructures, because we're using these programming level abstractions that allow the developer to understand that, well, the message comes in, the message comes out. At runtime, I map it to a different piece of infrastructure. What's cool about that to me is that he's making this wild bet on what the user experience should be. And his bet is that the detailed level of infrastructure doesn't matter. That if we got the programming primitives right, then programmers could focus on the programming primitives, operations people could focus on the rare moments where what they need to do is put a new piece of infrastructure into that primitive. And I'm interested to see if he's right. I think he's probably not. I say this with love in my heart. We had dinner together not that long ago. I love it. I hope that it works. I'm a fan. What a good bet. It's not the bet. I'm not making that bet because I don't think it'll, I don't know that I think it'll work, but I will love to see it because it pushes forward the state of the art. And there is undoubtedly, if you today build systems using modern serverless and your choice is Wing or serverless, Wing all day.
Yeah.
All day. All day. Such a better experience. Incredible. Way better. Do I think that it then grows to become the primary mechanism by which all the automation we use throughout the entirety of industry change? No. But I think System Initiative could, and that's why I'm building it.
There you go. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's interesting from what I've been able to gather from the videos is, and I've seen this pretty frequently with operations engineers. You said earlier, and I'll note when you said earlier, you threw quotes around real programmers. Because they do matter. Their work is really important. Behind the simplest hello world on the internet, there's a ton of operations happening behind the scenes. But I still meet a lot of operations people today that might not know how to program, I guess, in more formal languages. They know Bash, maybe they're learning some HCL. And the idea that these people that are generally outnumbered by their engineering counterparts, right, who are always drowning in debt, the idea that they have time to sit down, learn to program something, learn about all the cloud resources while dealing with their debt, serving their customers, their engineering customers is pretty, it's asking a lot of a small team, right? And to be able to start diagramming stuff where it's a layer that we can all look at and understand. Whether you understand the language or not seems pretty novel.
I think it is. I mean, the tricky part is that it's only useful if what you're expressing is the actual complexity that then turns into the work that you need to do. If it's just like, wouldn't it be great if we looked at a diagram together? The answer is no. That's why we don't spend a bunch of time diagramming stuff before we do it. Yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes we do, but mostly we don't, because it's mostly a waste of time, and you might as well just fucking do it.
Yeah.
And so, so like, yeah, it is novel that that's the interface that System Initiative presents to you. But the reason we present it is even more novel. Like, we present it that way because it turns out that 99% of the difficulty in the way you write infrastructure as code is not expressing a single resource as code. It's in expressing the relationships between the web of those things and how that data informs one another. Mm-hmm. And expressing those relationships as variables extracted in source code that can't react to changes in the real world because it's static data. It's in Git. Like, in order to make it react, it's a programming language. So I'd have to pull it open. I'd have to parse it, right? I'd have to then write back to it. And like, then what do? I check it in? Like, it blows your mind when you think about trying to make it reactive. Like, that's what's incredible about that diagram. If you look at the diagram that is the primary composition interface in System Initiative, it's easy to look at it and be like, well, fun. It's like a diagrammy tool. But like, no. What that thing's doing is writing the data that then gets transformed into the code that then manages the real world and can react to the data that changes in the real world in real time. That's sick. And that's why it's cool, because it's not just that because the story that people tell a lot, and it's a story of a lot of failed technology, is I'm going to take this incredibly complex thing and I'm going to simplify it for you. And that's what you want. And the history of that is no. Just no. It turns out that most people's complexity is there for a reason. Like, you made those choices for a reason. And the tools that you use, they have to be able to deal with that complexity, and they have to be able to deal with your reason for choosing it. And if they don't, then they're not useful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what has been the hardest part of building and designing System Initiative? Is it
so many different things? I mean, it's taken a long time. So there's just it's not because I didn't want to ship it. You know what I mean? It's not like we've been sitting here hoping it could take longer. I think so like, there's a lot of things that were hard, but the hardest has been getting to a place where you understand that reactive graph of is actually the core primitive. And then thinking about the fact that once you realize that that's true, that everything winds up on that graph. So like, when you think about, okay, it's this big web of reactive functions, how do I manage the functions over time? How do I let you change the simulation in real time? So like, let's say you have deployed a bunch of stuff and you have a new security policy. So, an audit comes through, they tell you, hey, we got to make sure that all our Docker containers only come from an internal registry we control. No more public Docker images. So in System Initiative, you can go to the built-in editor, open the Docker asset, and edit and just add a qualification to it that says all images come from our internal registry. And it's just a little TypeScript function. And then you press a button and it will then upgrade all of the Docker images in your entire system to reflect that new behavior. And you can do it in a change set that shows you that result only for you. So if you flipped out of that change set, if I had another one open, I wouldn't see your code change that changes the behavior of those Docker images. And instead, we would wait until you apply that thing to the main view that is the like canonical reflection of what you say you think you want and the real world at the same time. And then once you hit that button, I have to be able to take that code that you've merged to that mainline branch that reflects reality, and I have to update every other open change, because now reality has moved while you're also making changes.
Yeah.
That's fucking hard.
Yeah.
And then, and that's true for every property of every configuration variable you set. It's true for It's true for sharing across different people. So like if you build new functionality and you want to share it with me, like I need to extract it from your graph and then I import it into mine. And then I need to track that lineage so that when you publish changes and I've made changes, because I can edit any function at any time, nothing's closed. There's no private things. So in the end, like I got to be able to track all of that around for all of it. And like making that system work reliably and powerfully and at speed is no joke.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Well, I want to be conscious.
And it kind of has to all work or not at all. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, you know, because infrastructure as code's really good. So if it's not fantastic, then it's not good enough.
Has to be a big enough leap.
Mm-hmm.
Can't go backwards. Awesome. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour here. I'd love to know, just, you know, what advice would you give to current or aspiring DevOps engineers or infra ops? I made the mistake of opening Twitter this morning.
Oh no! Why you got to be like that?
I'm sorry. Yeah, what advice would you give to people that are, you know, aspiring to be DevOps engineers or systems administrators or just, you know, anybody moving forward in their career?
Oh, you know, being great at your job, being great at this work is fundamentally about how connected you can be to the teams that you do the work with and to the outcomes that the organization that you work for is trying to achieve. And so getting great at communicating with other people, working closely with them, understanding what is it that they need, what is it that the problem is, and then knowing that your job isn't just to solve the problem, but instead to find the best path that then opens up perhaps a solution that's better than what anybody else could have ever imagined, right? You know, people are often right about the problems they have, right? They know my leg hurts. They know that they stubbed their toe. They know whatever. They're often wrong about the solution, you know? And I think I think if I had one piece of career advice, it would be, you know, get comfortable and good at interrogating the connective tissue between the work that's in front of you and why it matters. And if you can get really good and relentless at being able to do that, then your ability to come up with incredible solutions will spike. And that will always do well for you sort of career-wise. I think, yeah.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the time. Adam Jacob of System Initiative, you can check him out at systeminit.com. And the project's also open source.
Everything's open source. Yeah. Every line of it's open source.
So get in there and close some issues.
Wouldn't that be a treat?
Yeah. Are there any good first issues? You got any labeled good first issues?
No, not yet. I mean, it's a complicated code base.
Yeah.
So I'd love to have someone contribute. So I can't wait for you to come. If what you want to do is do that, like I'm all in. Come hang out with us on Discord. We will. I got bugs. I'll give them to you. So yeah, we're all in. But yeah, I think more of that will come as people use the platform.
Awesome. And where else can people find you online?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm AdamHJK. That's where I'm sort of most active, for better or for worse. I'm Adam at systeminit.com. You can always send me an email. My phone number is in public all the time. So, you know, and I'm an old person. So like I answer the phone, even if I don't know who the number is, which is dumb.
Yeah. If you're a sales rep, don't ignore that.
It's not going to help. It's fine. So, you know, if you have questions, you can always call me. And yeah, I try to look what we decided to do, both as engineers and as entrepreneurs and as executive. All of those things are hard. And so, you know, I try to be as available as I can be if people have questions or need help. Like I try to offer it as much as I can. So, you know, if there's things you think I can help you with, I'm so happy to do that. If you ask.
That is awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Platform Engineering Podcast. Have a topic you would love to learn more about? Let us know at Cory@massdriver.cloud. That's CORY@MASSDRIVER.cloud. Catch you on the next one.